In my experience, creating something and making it open source, that's the process of that is not that complicated. Like you slap a license on it, you put the source code out to somewhere in the open, and then people stumble on it or you advertise it. That's part of the first steps, and the rest is history kind of thing. So as you mentioned that you put out the project and you still did a little bit of internal development on the project, which in my experience also happens kind of often, that especially when a group of people starts an open source project who don't have a lot of experience in the open source space, then it's not that self-explanatory how to do the design and development and everything in the public and open space. It sounds like that for the Chapel project, you had the right ideas, and then as you were progressing with the project after literally creating it, you still needed to learn about those steps in terms of getting more comfortable with that public and open space and start to do the design and development there. Do you remember how long it took for you to step out of this? Maybe we should not develop this internally and then share what we did sort of a little bit after the fact, but making the whole entire process open source. Like when did you get to that point in the like the Chapel project creation phase?
So you're definitely right that, particularly given the time we're talking about, right? So think of 2003 as when we were having these meetings, trying to figure out what we were building and how. And some of the coding started probably in mid to late 2003, I would guess. I was checking our repository. The first commit to our repository was January 2004, but that first commit had a lot of code in it. So obviously we had been developing before that. And I think it's exactly what you were saying, that it's not as though we were invested in keeping it secret and keeping it to ourselves or anything. It was more just sort of, at that time, there were large communities working on open source. There were not sort of publicly easily accessible ones like GitHub or GitLab today, where you could just jump on and sort of spin up your own repository and suddenly you've got it, right? So at that time, I think we didn't know a lot about hosting an open source repository, creating an open source community, things like that. And so we leaned on my connections still back to the University of Washington. And I think we actually applied for a small grant there or something like that to help with this. But essentially, they provided hosting services for us for those first few years and helped us with things like revision control and access, and kind of took care of the sysadmin part of it. At that time, Cray didn't really have the resources ourselves, or sort of the legacy of open source software that we had by the end of the project and that HPE has today, to host an open source project ourselves. So partnering with University of Washington on it made sense in terms of letting them play to their strengths, and we could focus on the language and the compiler. But over time, I think as the notion of how open source software was developed evolved in the community, we evolved to meet that. And so sometimes this was things related to tools. Like when we first started at the University of Washington, we were using CVS, which is an older Unix-based revision control system. And then at some point, I remember the University of Washington admins coming to us and saying, there's this great new thing called Subversion. You should be using it instead. And we're like, oh, okay. And so we started using that. And then at some point, it became, I think, known that, oh, if you're an open source project for real in this day and age, you should be on SourceForge. At least that's what, leadership in our company thought. And so it was in 2009 that we made the jump from being hosted at the University of Washington over to SourceForge. And again, that sort of started to bring us into more of an ecosystem developed for open source projects. I remember it had mailing lists. We could have kind of a very perfunctory web page through them. And again, sort of it took care of the administrative aspects of running an open source repository and doing releases and things. And then later, as GitHub rose to prominence, we both switched from Subversion to Git as our revision control software, and also switched to GitHub, which, even at the time we switched to it, we weren't particularly early adopters, but, it was sort of, I would say, heads and shoulders above SourceForge in terms of capabilities and modern interface and things like that. So yeah, there was very much this evolution in our project of like, I think we thought of ourselves as open source from the start because we knew we were going to release as open source, but sort of the specifics of how we developed the source and how we fostered a community and fostered collaborations and accepted source definitely went through many evolutions over the course of the project, and probably will evolve further still going into the future, I imagine.